When wild places are pushed too far, nature pushes back in ways no one forgets. From fog-covered villages to remote mountain cabins, these are true stories of survival when humans cross paths with nature's most dangerous predators. In this video, we'll share 6 harrowing first-hand accounts of grizzly bear attacks, from deadly village raids to terrifying solo encounters in the wilderness. These chilling tales will show you exactly how quickly calm turns to chaos when bears attack. On March 14th, 2020, in the fog-covered hills of Ussuri-Krai, a fishing village named Turovka stood near the edge of a cold river where pine forests met rocky slopes. Around 20 families lived there, mostly elders, women, and a few children. The men often left for days at a time to hunt or trap in the surrounding hills. Among the villagers was an older woman named Galina, who had lived in Turovka her whole life. She knew every bend in the stream and remembered each storm that had ever shaken the village. Her son was away hunting that week, along with most of the other men. The village relied on fish, wild roots, and the forest to survive. Wooden racks lined the shore to dry salmon, and small boats rested along the banks. Turovka had no phone lines and only a weak electric generator, which often failed during bad weather. People used lanterns, cooked over stoves, and passed stories by firelight. One of those stories was about a strange bear seen near the poacher's trail the previous winter. Some called it the beast. Others claimed it was just a tale told to frighten children. But changes had started weeks earlier. Fish racks were knocked over, boards broken as if struck by something massive. Nets were found shredded. Some cabins bore deep claw marks, cuts so forceful they peeled wood like paper. Galina noticed the signs. One morning, a neighbor's goat was discovered dead near the forest edge, torn apart with nothing eaten. At night, dogs barked endlessly, their voices sharp with alarm. Still, no one believed something worse could truly happen. Then came the fog. It settled thick and low that morning, making the river nearly invisible and the trees darker still. The power had gone out again, and most men had not yet returned from the hunt. The village felt empty. Galina sat near her stove, boiling water, when a sound broke through the silence. First heavy steps, then a crash, then the screams of animals. She rushed to the window but saw only white mist. A loud crack shook her small home, the sound coming from the neighbor's cabin. The walls trembled again. Glass shattered. Something was moving fast. Galina stepped back, her heartbeat quickening. Outside, something heavy slammed into the goat shed. Wood split, animals cried out, and then all went silent. Another door gave way with a splintering snap. The fog was now alive with noise, shouts, crashes, and roars that seemed to come from every direction. People darted between houses, but most remained hidden. One figure staggered through the mist, arms streaked with blood, and collapsed behind Galina's gate without moving again. The sound drew nearer, heavy breathing, claws scraping over stone. The village was no longer merely quiet. It had become a place of fear. The beast had arrived, and the worst was still to come. The heavy steps moved past Galina's cabin, leaving shattered boards and cracked windows in their wake. She crouched low beneath a table, hands clamped over her ears, as the air outside filled with deep growls and splintering wood. The beast rampaged through the village center, destroying anything it touched. One home was crushed beside the woodpile. A roof caved in over the spot where children had once played. Nothing stood in its path. At the heart of the settlement, it toppled an old water barrel and smashed into the food shed. Empty cans and dried fish spilled across the ground. Chickens scattered in all directions, some caught mid-run and tossed aside. The fog made it hard to see, but the sounds told the story. Boards snapping like bones, voices crying out from homes that had once felt secure. At the far end of the path, an old man tried to climb onto his porch. The beast spotted him. In a single charge it struck, sending the man hurtling into a wall. He did not rise again. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the sound of the beast moving on. People remained hidden, praying it would pass. But it did not. It moved from one building to the next, breaking fences and smashing windows without pause. Soon, it reached the fishing huts. Boats flipped over, nets ripped apart, racks of salmon flattened under massive paws. The riverbank looked as though a storm had swept through it. Blood mixed with fish remains, and feathers drifted in the air like ash. A young girl, hiding beneath a storage box, watched through narrow gaps as the beast passed within inches. She held her breath, unmoving. The onslaught lasted nearly half an hour. Then the noise began to fade. The fog concealed the beast's form as it retreated into the trees. It left behind deep, water-filled tracks in the earth and claw marks high on the cabin walls, some above head height. Smoke curled from a broken lamp, and the sharp scent of oil mingled with the metallic tang of blood. When the quiet returned, survivors emerged slowly. Some wept, others stared in stunned silence. 4 people had lost their lives, and many more were injured. The village's appearance had changed in minutes. Walls smashed, roofs torn open, doors hanging from splintered frames. Food stores were ruined. Animals were gone. A place that had once been a refuge now felt exposed and fragile. By evening, help arrived from the next valley. They found fearful faces and wounded bodies. Fires were lit to warm cold hands. Bandages were applied, and the names of the living were counted. Some villagers refused to sleep that night. Others packed what little remained and left at first light. In the weeks that followed, Turovka emptied. One by one, the homes were abandoned. The forest slowly reclaimed the land. Only broken beams and overgrown paths remained. The scars on the walls and the memories of that day told a story no one would forget. The beast had come and proven that even the quietest places could fall. On April 18, 2020, the late light stretched across the grounds of a quiet zoo in Central Europe. One of the keepers, Elena Novak, had worked there for nearly 12 years. She was 34, known for her calm nature and deep care for the animals. Elena had grown up near the Carpathian Mountains and had loved wildlife since childhood. Her days were spent feeding, cleaning, and making sure each animal remained healthy and safe. She had special training in large mammal behavior and had worked closely with the brown bears for the past 5 years. Among them was Bruno, a massive male bear raised in the zoo since he was a cub. Elena followed the same routine every evening. She waited until the last visitor left, then walked along the outer path toward the brown bear enclosure. She wore her standard uniform and gloves and carried tools for cleaning, along with a long wooden stick used for feeding and guiding large animals. That day, nearby construction work caused deep rumbling sounds and strong vibrations. Heavy machines moved across the rear of the zoo, and the fences shook slightly with each passing truck. At the time of the noise, Elena had just stepped into the enclosure to clear fallen branches and trash before the night team arrived. She closed the gate behind her, as required, and looked toward the far side of the area where Bruno rested in his holding pen. The air felt still, but the repeated thuds from construction had clearly unsettled the bear. Bruno paced and let out sharp grunts. Without warning, he slammed against the side wall of his cage. A weak section of fencing, worn from years of use and loosened further by the nearby equipment's vibrations, gave way. Bruno forced himself through the opening in seconds, stepping into the open space where Elena stood. The way out was now blocked. She turned quickly and stepped backward, moving toward the smaller safety cage inside the pen. But Bruno noticed her movement and reacted instantly. With a deep growl, he charged. His feet struck the dirt hard, and within moments, he reached her. She barely made it to a metal support post before he stood on his hind legs and slammed into her with his full weight. Her back hit the pole, and her legs weakened. She grabbed her stick and placed it between herself and the bear, pushing with all her strength. His weight pressed down, and his claws raked across her left arm. Pain shot through her side as her opposite shoulder struck the pole again. Blood streaked the floor. She kept her eyes locked on his face, knowing this could help in dangerous encounters. Her arms were cut and her muscles burned. Still, she held the stick steady, preventing him from reaching her throat. Time slowed. Bruno snarled and pressed harder. Elena clenched her jaw and refused to give in. She knew help had to arrive soon. Her arms trembled from holding the stick in place. Her breathing grew shallow as blood ran down her sleeves. She leaned back against the cold metal, using every remaining bit of strength to keep herself upright. The bear's hot breath filled the air, loud and heavy. Her legs weakened further, but her focus did not waver. She understood that surrendering now would lead to far worse injuries. Outside the enclosure, staff had already heard the commotion and rushed to the fence. They saw the broken section and understood the danger inside. The animal team quickly spread out, one keeper calling for assistance, while others grabbed the tranquilizer kit. From a safe corner, one aimed carefully through a narrow gap in the bars. The dart had to be placed precisely to avoid harming either the bear or Elena. Seconds felt like hours. The first dart struck, but Bruno did not retreat. He growled more fiercely, reacting to the sting. Elena remained still. Her back throbbed, and her arms felt heavier by the moment. The bear swayed slightly, unsettled by the impact. A second shot followed shortly after. This time, the sedative began to take effect. His weight shifted, claws sliding lower, and his head drooped. Elena felt the pressure lessen. Her arms dropped, and the stick slipped from her hands. She slid to the ground, no longer able to stand. Bruno stepped back, blinking slowly, pacing in a small circle and growling once more before collapsing onto his side near the gate. The team waited briefly to ensure he was fully sedated before two keepers entered the pen. One supported Elena while the other checked her injuries. Her face was pale and her eyes half closed. Cuts covered both arms, and her shoulder was badly bruised from the impact. They moved her onto a stretcher and carried her out quickly. As the gate closed behind them, others secured the enclosure and placed warning signs nearby. Paramedics arrived and began treatment immediately. Her pulse was rapid but steady. She was transported to the hospital for surgery. Doctors discovered broken bones in her left arm and deep bite marks near her wrist. Her ribs were bruised, and her back was sore from the collision with the post. The medical team worked for hours before transferring her to a quiet recovery room. Family members visited, along with co-workers who brought cards and small gifts. Days became weeks, and Elena began walking again, slowly regaining her strength. The zoo conducted a full review of the incident. All fencing was inspected, and weak points were reinforced. New safety procedures were introduced, and the bear enclosure was modified to prevent similar situations in the future. Elena's name was added to the Keeper Safety Program as a reminder of what she had endured. She returned to work later that year. Her arms bore scars, but her gaze remained steady. She never forgot the events of that day. The zoo continued to be part of her life, now with stronger rules and deeper respect for the unpredictability of wildlife. The lesson had been learned. On April 17, 2023, the woods surrounding a quiet cabin in northern Montana were just beginning to thaw after a long and bitter winter. Samuel Hayes, a 47-year-old man with a calm spirit and a strong build, was clearing thick brush behind his home. He had lived in that remote area for over a decade, drawn by the peaceful land and the space to raise his daughter away from noise and crowds. A former carpenter, Samuel enjoyed working with his hands and teaching simple skills to his teenage daughter, Emily. They lived in a wooden cabin Samuel had built himself, heated by a stove and surrounded by tall trees. That morning, Samuel had taken his gloves and axe out to trim old branches and thick weeds. He moved slowly along the tree line, cutting dead wood and tossing it into a pile. Emily, 15 years old, had walked a little farther to collect pieces of dry wood for the fire. She wore her father's old backpack and was accustomed to helping him with small chores. The land felt quiet, but not silent. Birds called from the trees, and snowmelt dripped onto the mossy ground. Unbeknownst to them, the forest nearby had grown restless. A black bear, large and underfed, had been roaming close to homes in search of food. It had survived the winter, but barely. Ice had melted too quickly, and berries had not yet returned. The bear had lost its usual caution and had grown bold. Tracks showed it had passed through cabins and refuse sites in recent days, hungry and desperate. As Samuel moved closer to a dense corner of brush, a sudden rustle broke the air. At first, it sounded like wind. Then came the heavy thud of footsteps. A black mass rushed from the trees with speed and force. The bear charged, jaws open, eyes wide. There was no warning, no pause. Samuel turned just as it reached the edge of the clearing. Emily, hearing the sound, looked up from behind a fallen log. In that split second, Samuel stepped forward and pushed her back. His arms moved quickly, knocking her down and away from the charging animal. The bear struck him hard, claws raking across his shoulder. He fell beneath its weight as it bit deep into his chest. Emily scrambled to her feet, the bear's back turned toward her. Blood spread across the ground as her father struggled beneath the heavy animal. In shock but not frozen, Emily grabbed a long, sharp stick from the pile nearby. With both hands, she swung it hard at the bear's face, once, then again. The wood cracked against bone. The bear paused, blinking and shaking its head. The blows gave just enough time. The animal turned and ran back into the trees, slow but wild. Emily dropped the stick, her breath sharp and uneven. Her father lay still. Blood soaked his shirt. His hand was outstretched, his eyes open. Emily knelt beside him, pressing her small hands over the deep wounds on his chest. The snow beneath him was stained red. His breath was weak, his face pale. She cried quietly, unsure of what to do first. Her hands shook as she checked for a pulse. It was fading. Her voice rose in a call for help, but there was no one close enough to hear. The trees stood tall and still. Only the wind moved through the branches. She looked around quickly. The bear was gone, but its path was clear. Broken branches, torn leaves, and fresh claw marks stretched toward the woods. Fear pressed on her, but she stayed with her father. He did not speak. His eyes blinked slowly, then stilled. She pressed her forehead to his chest, hoping to feel warmth, but it was already fading. Emily sat in silence, trying to be brave, though her heart felt unbearably heavy. After some time passed, she forced herself to stand. Her arms were sore, her legs weak. She ran through the trees toward the nearest homes. The cabin they had built together was half a mile away. Each step felt long and difficult. Twigs scratched her face. Her shoes slipped on mud and patches of snow. But she did not stop. When she reached the clearing near the road, her voice finally carried far enough. A neighbor came running. His eyes widened when he saw the blood on her shirt. He grabbed a phone and called for help. Other locals gathered, following her back to the place where her father had fallen. No one spoke much. The scene told its own story. They placed a blanket over Samuel's body. The bear's tracks led into thick trees. A call was made to wildlife officers, who arrived later with tracking dogs. By evening, the animal was found resting near a dry creek bed. It did not run. It stood tall and growled. The officers raised their rifles and fired. The threat was ended, but the loss could not be undone. The cabin, once full of life, now felt cold and quiet. The tools still hung by the door. A chair sat beside the fire, untouched. Emily stayed with a family friend for the next few weeks. Her arms bore scratches, and her knees were bruised. But her eyes carried something deeper. The forest had taken her father, but it had also revealed his love. He had stepped forward without hesitation, protecting her even when it cost him everything. The funeral was small. Neighbors came with quiet faces. The wind moved through the trees as people shared soft words. A wooden cross was placed near the cabin. It stood on a hill where wildflowers would bloom in spring. Emily visited it every day for a time. The forest never spoke again, but the marks it left behind would always remain. On February 8, 2023, heavy snow fell across the forested hills of northern Scandinavia. Wind howled over the rooftops of a small wooden cabin tucked far from any main road. Inside, Henrik Anderson stayed near the fire with his wife Clara and their 2 young children. Henrik had lived in the mountains his whole life. He worked as a woodworker and had built the cabin himself years earlier. The family often stayed there during the cold seasons, far from city noise. They grew food in warmer months and kept goats and chickens behind the cabin. Henrik loved the quiet. His children played in the snow, learned about trees, and helped care for the animals. Clara prepared meals from scratch and taught the children to read using old storybooks. Life was simple but full. They had electricity from a small generator and used wood to stay warm. The family was prepared for most weather, but this storm was worse than any they had seen before. By night, thick clouds blocked the moon. Snow fell in heavy lines, covering windows and doors. The wind shook the walls, and branches tapped against the roof. Around midnight, strange sounds echoed from outside. The goats bleated loudly. Then came loud bangs like wood being slammed. Henrik stood, pulled on his coat, and looked out through a small glass pane. He saw shapes moving near the barn, then the larger shape of something big. A brown figure moved close to the house. Henrik's eyes went wide. A grizzly bear, large and rough, paced near the front of the cabin. Its fur was wet and dark, and it sniffed the air as it moved. It had already broken the barn fence. Now it was near the side window. Henrik backed away and motioned for Clara to take the children to the back room. The bear rose on its legs and slammed its weight against the window frame. Glass cracked. With one more hit, it shattered. Cold air rushed inside. Henrik grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a long metal poker from beside the fireplace. The bear climbed halfway into the living room, its breath steaming in the cold air. Its eyes were wide and wild, claws digging into the wooden floor. Henrik stepped forward, waving the iron bar. Clara hurried the children into the side hallway and opened the far door. The snow outside was deep, but it was their only chance. She pulled them out one by one, their boots sinking into the powder. Henrik swung hard at the bear's shoulder. The animal growled, swiped its paw, and struck him across the side. Henrik fell against the wall. Blood stained his coat, but he pushed himself back up. The bear turned, roaring. Henrik raised the poker again, weak but still standing. The wild eyes of the bear locked onto him as snow swirled through the broken window. The next moment changed everything. The bear took another step inside, paws heavy on the broken floor. Henrik felt lightheaded, but his grip stayed firm on the long bar. His side burned from the hit, and warm blood ran down his back. Outside, the storm howled through the trees, covering the ground in thick snow. The family had vanished into the cold, leaving the door wide open. Wind pushed snow through the shattered window and across the floor. Henrik backed toward the fireplace, trying to keep distance between himself and the large animal. The heat at his back gave him a small measure of strength. The bear growled again, then turned toward the open door. Its body filled the narrow space. It looked into the dark outside, paused, then slowly backed away. With one strong push, it turned and ran into the storm, vanishing behind swirling snowflakes. Henrik fell to his knees, holding the side of his body. His breath came in short gasps. The room was quiet, except for the wind blowing through the open door and broken glass. The smell of the wild lingered in the air. The wood floor was marked with deep claw lines, and the walls bore dents from the heavy body. Bits of fur and splintered window frame lay scattered across the ground. Outside, Clara had taken the children to a nearby shed behind the trees. They waited there, curled under old blankets. Henrik called out faintly and stepped into the snow. Clara saw his shape and rushed to meet him. His face was pale, and his jacket was torn in several places. She helped him walk to the shed, where he collapsed onto a dry patch of hay. Through the night, they kept him warm, using extra clothes and layers of blankets. The family waited in silence, checking the storm through cracks in the wall. The fire in the cabin was gone. The power was out. Snow kept falling, building up around the door. At first light, the wind slowed and the air grew still. Clara made her way to the small radio and turned the crank until a faint signal came through. She sent out a short message and waited. 2 hours later, a distant sound rose from beyond the trees. Snowmobiles arrived with 2 rescue workers wearing thick coats and helmets. They found Henrik inside the shed, resting with his children beside him. He was lifted onto a wooden sled and wrapped in more layers. The machines carried him away through the snow-covered hills. Clara and the children followed in another sled. The long trip ended at a medical post where doctors cleaned his wounds and administered treatment. He had lost significant blood, but his heart remained strong. Henrik would not return to the cabin that winter. The storm had taken more than warmth. It had left behind fear, damage, and deep marks inside each of them. The hills stayed quiet, covered in white. The wild had passed, but its memory would not. On February 17, 2023, warm sunlight filtered through the leafy canopy of a dense forest in central India. Shafts of gold lit the mossy floor, shifting gently as the breeze stirred the branches above. Along the quiet paths and green shadows walked Maya Singh, a young woman well known to many online. At 23, she had built a large following by sharing videos of her adventures into wild places. Her channel and social posts drew thousands of viewers who followed her explorations through forests, hills, and rivers. With her phone, camera, and a practiced eye for framing a scene, she had captured moments that often went viral, turning her outdoor excursions into a digital portfolio admired around the world. Maya had grown up in a busy city, far from the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves, but her fascination with nature had grown quickly alongside her fame. Years of exploring had sharpened her confidence, though some would say it had also made her less cautious than she should be. That day, she was not entirely alone. A small group of hikers moved somewhere along the same route. But she had slipped away from the main path to find her own angles and views. Her eyes scanned every branch and stone, searching for something rare to show her followers. She wore sturdy sports shoes, a bright jacket that stood out in the shadows, and a small pack holding her phone, a water bottle, and a collapsible stick for taking photographs. Local warnings about the need to keep distance from wild animals had never slowed her before, and they did not slow her now. Midway through her walk, she noticed something unusual near a rocky outcrop, blanketed in dry grass and tangled vines. A broad, dark shape rested between 2 boulders, rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. It was a sloth bear, curled into a heavy ball of fur, seemingly asleep and unaware of her presence. Its coat was thick, the texture rough in places, and in the dappled light, the edges of its form blended into the stone. Its head was tucked close to its paws, and each breath made a faint sound in the still air. Maya paused, her pulse quickening at the chance for a rare close-up image. She stepped forward in measured silence, watching the light and shadow shift across the animal's body. All her focus narrowed to the shot she could frame, the detail of the fur, the natural backdrop, the stillness of the moment. She did not notice the 2 small cubs lying partly hidden beneath a bush, only a short distance away. The mother bear stirred. At first, it was a small movement, a shift of the shoulders, a twitch in the ear, but it was enough to break the illusion of safety. Maya held her breath, thinking she might still capture one last image before slipping back. The bear's head rose sharply, its eyes snapping open. In an instant, it was on its feet, a low, resonant sound rolling from its chest. Maya froze where she stood. The forest seemed to close in around her. Then, without warning, the animal charged. She turned in an instinctive attempt to run, but the ground between them vanished in a heartbeat. The bear struck with staggering force. A heavy paw slammed into her shoulder and another raked across her arm. The blow knocked her sideways, sending her sprawling into the dirt. A burst of pain surged through her body. Her shoulder burned, her arm felt as though it had been ripped by fire, and her chest tightened with shock. She rolled to the side, grit in her mouth and dry leaves tangled in her hair. The bear loomed over her for a heartbeat, its presence enormous and overwhelming, its movements restless and tense. The sounds it made were deep and guttural, reverberating in the space around her. Far behind her position, the hikers heard the commotion. The echoes of her scream carried through the trees, spurring them forward at a run. As they approached the area, the mother bear stepped back, her gaze locked on Maya. The cubs made small calls from beneath the bush, drawing the bear's attention. In a few swift steps, the animal turned and bounded toward them, disappearing into the dense undergrowth as quickly as it had appeared. Maya lay on the forest floor, trembling. Her jacket was torn, and her arm was streaked with blood from deep scratches. The scent of damp earth and crushed vegetation filled her senses. Every muscle in her body shook, a mix of pain and adrenaline making her hands unsteady. She tried to sit, digging her fingers into the soil for balance. The ache in her ribs throbbed where the bear's weight had landed. The hikers gathered around her in a tight, watchful circle, eyes flicking to the brush in case the bear returned. One signaled urgently for help, while another pressed a folded cloth to her arm to slow the bleeding. The air carried the faint scent of moss and moisture, grounding them in the reality of the wild space they occupied. No one dared to move her far without knowing the full extent of her injuries. A compact signal device was activated, sending a call for assistance. Time passed in tense silence until the sound of approaching engines broke through the quiet. Rescue workers in bright jackets arrived, following the transmitted signal. They worked quickly, cleaning her wounds with cold, clear water, wrapping her arm in fresh bandages, and checking her breathing and pulse. Her heart raced, but she responded to their instructions with small, deliberate nods. They lifted her carefully onto a stretcher, then began the slow journey back along the narrow path to a clearing where a vehicle waited. Rocks and roots hid beneath layers of fallen leaves, and every step required caution. The group moved steadily, some clearing obstacles ahead while others shared the weight of the stretcher. The forest, which had seemed alive with tension moments before, now felt subdued, though every snap of a twig made heads turn. At last, they reached the clearing. Maya was placed gently inside the vehicle and covered with a thick blanket. The doors closed with a firm click, and the engine rumbled to life. The hikers stood nearby, silent, their packs still in hand. Some sat on the low stones at the edge of the trail, staring at the forest as though trying to read its shadows. Maya would recover with time, but the marks left on her skin would take longer to fade. The wild had offered her countless beautiful moments before, but this time, it had left her with a sharp reminder. Respect for nature must always outweigh the desire for risk, for the balance between the two is fragile and unforgiving. On October 11, 2022, cold air moved through the valleys of Kodiak Island as the sun dipped behind the thick green hills. A man named Mark Jensen, 43 years old, set up his tent in the quiet heart of the forest. He had traveled far for this hunt, crossing rivers and hiking steep paths with heavy gear. Born and raised in northern Montana, Mark had spent his youth fishing in creeks and walking wooded trails with his grandfather. As an adult, he worked part-time as a carpenter, but saved each year for one long trip into the wild. This year, he chose the deep, remote parts of Alaska, where elk roamed the hills and where few dared to camp alone. Mark had planned for weeks. His backpack held everything he needed: dry food, water filters, tools, warm clothing, and a flare gun. He also carried a small cooler filled with elk meat he had already collected during the day. Near his tent, he built a simple rack out of fallen branches to hang and dry thin strips of meat. The air was crisp, and he felt proud of the preparation. The camp was quiet, and the trees around him stood tall and still, their tops swaying only slightly in the evening breeze. As the night deepened, Mark zipped up his sleeping bag and tried to rest. Outside, the only sounds were the slow rustling of wind and the faint hum of insects. The forest seemed still, but just before midnight, that peace shattered. A sharp crack echoed from beyond the trees, followed by the heavy thud of large footsteps. Something substantial was moving through the brush. A thick scent filled the air, wet fur and damp earth. Then came a loud crash as something slammed into the drying rack near his tent. Mark sat up fast, his pulse pounding. The deep, guttural growl that followed sent a cold wave through his chest. Outside the tent, a massive Kodiak bear had caught the scent of meat. It tore through the rack, splintering branches and tossing strips of dried meat into the grass. With wide paws and deliberate, powerful steps, it moved toward the tent. The ripping of fabric pierced the air as claws sliced through the outer walls. In seconds, the bear's large head pushed into the narrow space at the tent's front. Mark saw its dark eyes just feet away. Its breathing was loud and heavy, each exhale steaming in the cold air. Its sheer size filled the opening like a wall of muscle and fur. With no weapon immediately in reach, Mark grabbed for the flare gun tucked under a coat. The bear roared, shaking the tent violently. He aimed the small red gun and fired. A burst of orange light flared, casting the surrounding trees into sharp relief. The loud pop echoed through the forest. The flare streaked past the bear's ear, burning brightly. The animal flinched, shaking its head. Mark fired again. The second flare exploded above the wrecked rack, sparking against the night sky. The bear retreated a few paces, circling the camp with low, rumbling growls, but it did not vanish into the woods. Mark froze in place. His tent was half shredded, gear scattered, and the cooler smashed. The bear prowled just beyond the shadows, pacing in slow, deliberate arcs. He crouched low, his body tense. Cold seeped into his skin through the torn tent wall. The fading glow of the last flare barely lit the clearing, but he could still make out the broad, dark shape moving at the tree line. The animal's steps pressed heavily into the ground. Mark's grip on the empty flare gun tightened, knowing he had no more rounds left. The pungent scent of torn meat and spilled food hung in the air. Plastic wrappers, scraps of fabric, and bits of equipment lay strewn across the ground. The cooler's lid rested far from the body, dented and clawed. The drying rack had collapsed into a pile of broken branches. Every part of the camp showed signs of the bear's power. Mark strained to hear beyond his own breathing. The sounds of movement eventually faded, but he knew the predator might return. He stayed awake through the long, freezing hours, sitting with his back against a rock for protection. A deep scrape ran along his leg from when he had scrambled in the dark, and his elbow throbbed. Wind whistled through the holes in the tent, flapping loose fabric like damp leaves. He wrapped a coat tighter around himself, conserving what warmth he could. The bear never returned, but the night brought no rest. At first light, the full scope of the destruction became clear. Deep claw marks scored the bark of nearby trees. Tracks the size of dinner plates dotted the soft earth. Shredded gear lay across the clearing, some pieces pressed into the mud. His food supply was almost gone, only a few dry biscuits remained. The flare gun was empty, its case cracked. His water bladder was torn, and a boot had a gash where a tooth had grazed the leather. He salvaged what little he could, stuffing the remaining supplies into a smaller sack and tying it with cord. Most of his provisions were gone. With no fire-starting tools and only the clothes on his back, his only option was to reach the ranger cabin marked on his map, many miles to the south. The trail was harsh. Jagged stones bruised his feet, and fallen branches blocked the path. The chill from the night lingered, making his muscles stiff. He moved cautiously, drinking from streams and scanning the woods at every bend. Though no animals followed, each sound, a snapping twig, a gust through leaves, made him pause. The memory of the bear's breathing seemed to follow him. Hours passed before he reached a clearing where the small cabin stood. Smoke curled from its chimney, a sign of safety. Inside, 2 rangers helped him sit and gave him warm tea. He recounted the night's events, and they listened closely, jotting notes before sending a patrol to investigate. The team later confirmed the presence of a large bear from the tracks and the damage left behind. Mark stayed 2 nights in the shelter, nursing his bruises and cuts. When he finally left the island by boat, his pack was lighter and his supplies fewer. The experience had stripped away much of what he brought, but not his life. The wilderness had taken almost everything else, leaving him with a memory etched as sharply as claw marks in tree bark.